Welcome to our Dialogues in Development. Today we will be speaking about the trajectories of spatial violence in Southeast Asian cities. We're going to give just a few seconds for the rest of people to join us. Today we have a great lineup of people that will be engaging with us. It's always a great honor and privilege to have our colleagues, alumni, joining us to discuss very topical aspects in these dialogues in development. So today we are going to be discussing particularly the content of a report that has been made in the context of a wider research project. So today we are going to be discussing the findings of a regional report that we put together, and I will be sharing in the chat a link to the report so you can see the details. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. I guess we have already enough people to kick off the content. Let me know if you see well the presentation. Yep, can you see my PowerPoint? Okay. So welcome everyone. Today, as I was saying, we will be discussing the trajectories of spatial violence in Southeast Asian cities. I'm Catalina Ortiz. I will be chairing this event. I'm the PI of the research project where this report has been elaborated. We will have today with us Shoko Sakuma from Women for the World, Marina Kalubu-Kuri from Women for the World, both BUD alumni and long-term collaborator of us, working in the network of the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights. With us is also Giovanna Stolfo, co-program leader with myself of the BUD program, and Elizabeth Rhodes, who is our postdoctoral researcher in this research project. And we have also the honor to have as a discussant Hyun Bang Shin, who is the director of in the LSE about the Southeast Asian Cities Center. So today we're going to be covering few points. We're going to be discussing some conceptual elements about the spatial violence. We're going to be discussing the methodology that we undertook to produce this report. We're going to be reporting about the key findings, and we are going to be making a short reflection in terms of how the findings of this report also links to our research project called Yangon Stories. We're going to have some minutes about discussion, and we are going to be opening up the space for a Q&A. I suggest that your comments are put in the Q&A box. And so you have any questions of clarification, we will have the time to put it and discuss it there. So, but before going to the definition, the conceptual framing of this report, I think it's important to acknowledge that now we are going to be talking about a very important topic, that is spatial violence. And this is done in the context of the research project called Yangon Stories, how we use living heritage, let's say, as a tool to prevent the spatial violence. And for us today, we want to express our solidarity to our colleagues and our friends that are experiencing very, very hard times in Myanmar. So our heart is with them. So I'll give now the floor to my colleague Giovanna, so she can help us to understand a little bit how this project, and particularly the concept of spatial violence, has been used and referenced to inform the work we are doing. Gio?
Thanks, Catalina, and good afternoon, morning, and evening, everybody. I have 5 minutes to unpack spatial violence. I promise I will try my best. We know all too well that displacement plays a huge role in planetary urbanization. In Southeast Asia, especially, urban expansion is the result of long-term relocation and resettlement of populations. Take the city of Phnom Penh, for instance, which has grown exponentially due to the forced movement of unsettled groups from the city center to the periphery. The same happened in Yangon through the colonial logic of township creation. These two cities have a radically different post-colonial history, and yet some patterns are the same. The paradigm of spatial violence is one of them. Violent spatial practices are usually fabricated during colonial times and continue afterwards, during pseudo-democratic governments. Such practices are produced by and themselves produce laws, regulations, and social spatial orders. Space and violence are tightly connected, forming a sort of trinity with coloniality. But what is spatial violence and why are we using it in the context of Southeast Asian cities? How can violence be spatial? Is violence a means or an end in the production of space? And more importantly, what is the value of a spatial analysis of violence? Well, these are some of the questions driving our British Academy project and regional analysis conducted as part of the Work Package 3 and included in the working paper that we are launching today. We know that space is not an empty canvas for urban processes to take place. It is rather a central agent in the reproduction of power accumulation as well as violence. And yet, when we think of violence, we generally refer to situations of war, warfare, tangible and visible destruction and ruination. Less frequently, we think of violence as embedded in routine spatial practices. And for this reason, we don't challenge it directly. Political philosophers and critical theorists have engaged in a discussion of violence, especially normalized violence. Zizek, for instance, differentiates between subjective and objective violence. The first is the one that is exercised by a specific actor, while the latter is a type of violence that is already there, that is inherent to a status quo, and that we do not detect or perceive as violence. That is the violence of planning practices. The notion of objective violence is close to the well-known notion of structural violence, a violence for which no one is accountable for, as it is part of society and cultural formations. Bourdieu wrote of symbolic violence as that gentle, invisible form of violence, which is never recognized as such and is not so much undergone as chosen. Similarly, the notion of slow violence sees violence as a slow and gradual process rather than a catastrophic event, one that kills. This violence takes the shape of an ensemble of violent acts. Think of policies that reduce food supply in sub-Saharan African countries, or think of planning and transport regulations that reduce land access in Palestine. These are just two examples of how violence is invisibly embedded in planning, well, sometimes not, but invisibly, and enacted in a processual form. Our inability to recognize violence and respond affectively to it is ununderstandable, but it also implies we take part in reproducing it. Violence thus becomes sustained and generative. By generative, I mean that it produces new relations, new plans, new laws, and it needs space in order to do so. Forced relocation is one of a multitude of violent acts that have space at the center. Other forms of spatial violence include privatization, exclusion, expulsion, seclusion, apartheid, ghettoization, extraction. It is actually an endless repertoire of slow processes sanctioned by the law and enacted through planning practices. Taken all together, they become a form of social, political, and economic order that is not an interruption, but rather a continuum in the political history of a certain place, a certain city. If we examine post-colonial planning practices in Phnom Penh or Yangon, we can see how the experience of violence during colonialism is internalized and re-emerges later in the set of contemporary plans, regulations, and policies. When the continuum of planned violence manifests through an ensemble of tactics and strategies undertaken to control space and consolidate political authority, we call it territorialization. Territorialization is another way of seeing the link between violence and planning. Here, violence is instrumental to the destruction of an established order, but it is also conducive to the creation of a new one. So on one side, violence is damaging and destructive, but this destructive character can bring about multiple transformations. This also means that destruction and violence are constitutive of the production of space. What is interesting to add is that not all forms of territorialization and spatial violence come from the state. While states are the privileged territorializing agents, they are not the only ones. Back to Zizek's idea of objectivity. If violence is everywhere, if it is diffused in the social body, then this means that there are forms of violence and territorialization from elsewhere, from below, from the margin. Benjamin, for instance, Walter Benjamin, even perceived violence in the legal, non-violent action of striking work. Agamben, discussing the limits of violence, writes about revolutionary violence, a violence from below with no use, that is able to deactivate the link between violence and the law. Because it's the law that enables the reproduction of violence. Only by making it unexecutable, we can expose the violence behind it. We have operated for centuries under the assumption that states can use violence to enforce the law. Through this system, endless forms of violence can be perpetrated lawfully. They are not even regarded as violence. Think about the Land Act in Cambodia, the farmland law in Burma, and how they enable dispossession. That kind of large-scale dispossession is only possible through the law, and the law masks its violence. Redevelopment, relocation, even gentrification, they are never seen as violent either, strictly speaking. Even if they are actually forms of harm, we never recognize or perceive them as such. When planning practices are not considered violent, they become unquestionable. So the link in violence and law to expose the violence of space becomes a difficult task. In the peripheries of Yangon and Phnom Penh and many other cities in Southeast Asia, in the most deprived townships and relocation sites, there are groups of dwellers who do not wait for the cue of legitimacy to take control over the land. They enact forms of counter-territorialization that precede legitimacy, that challenge and replace institutional orders. And that is precisely one way of deactivating the trinity of space, violence, and coloniality, even if it is for a moment. Our British Academy project examines a series of moments like this. However, it is also really difficult to have hope in a moment like this, as Catalina said, of escalating violence as the one that we are seeing in Myanmar at the moment. And with this, I conclude and leave the floor to my colleagues who will be presenting key aspects of the report.
Thank you, Giovanna. Very thoughtful comments, as usual. I think, let me share again the presentation. Having issues finding the file now. But just to, before I give again the floor to Shoko and Marina, are you looking at the slides now? Yep, okay. So we decided to interrogate what could be the regional patterns of spatial violence in order to locate what could be the singularities of the Yangon case. So it's in that context where this report arises. So, Shoko and Marina.
Hi, so I'm going to present about the methodology briefly first. In order to understand about the cities, in order to understand different spectrum, we selected 6 cities for this study, which have different scales, size, and socio-political backgrounds. And data availability was another criterion because this was conducted based on the secondary data. About the lenses, To contextualize displacement in the broader context of urban development, we looked through the trajectories of urbanization driven by different actors in different times and settings. This was actually a reiterative process, and we explored several elements in a very fluid manner. Next slide, please. So after the data collection and analysis, we recategorized our findings into these 4 lenses, which we are going to present today. Next slide, please. About the political regimes of urbanization. So before the 1930s, none of these selected cities had a population larger than 600,000. But in the aftermath of Japanese occupation, the breakdown of the colonial control and the insecurity of rural areas led to the migration. As emerging centers of economic activities, these cities continue to be magnets of capital investment and the people. As showing the line graphs on the table on the slide, the experience of economic and population growth are notably diverse. But overall, with both population and economic growth hand in hand, the demands for the residential, commercial, and the industrial development became more, although the supply did not meet the actual demands. Next slide, please. This shows the timeline of each city, which we try to find a relation between political regimes and the practices of spatial violence. We will go into the detail later, but overall, irrespective of political regimes pressures for the economic development in the globalized market system led to an urge for the development project. For this to happen, the need for the land led to significant land transformation and speculations, which brought to the city expansion as well. Next slide, please. Then, so about capturing the elite interest. In the early stage, urban development was mostly dictated through the state rather than the planning professionals. Some relied on the plans developed during the colonial period. Under the authoritarian regime like Jakarta and Manila, cities tried to build iconic monuments and the infrastructures for the beautification. In Philippines, Cambodia, and Vietnam, democratization led the cities to open up their economy to investors even more. Emerging middle class and the upper and middle class were also the key drivers for the many projects. About the planning landscape, such as the types used, creation of master plans varied across the cities. In most cases, it was shaped by the visions of beautiful, clean, modern cities. Which some of them follow the modern cities like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. Private sector's involvement was notably strongly observed in Manila, assumingly due to their state's decentralized system, plus the culture of rich family business since the colonial period, as well as Phnom Penh after the Civil War, where the new authority did not have the capacity to handle urban planning. Next slide, please. This map shows the middle class and the elite real estate project in Jakarta, which is a typical spatial pattern of the development concentrated in the center and expanding to the peripheral areas as the new towns. Next slide, please. Also, in order to understand how the violence was operated to certain population, we also explored the intersecting exclusionary invisibility. In all the studied cities, urban development has proceeded with the production and maintenance and expansion of informal settlements. More often than not, they are not fully recognized as a citizen, for example, no ID card, and their settlements are perceived as blank areas by planners, developers, and authorities. So the population was not included. The table on the slide shows some existing data of informal settlements, but because of the nature of the invisibility, the record was we found was incomplete. From our study, we found the different types of origins and marginalization processes of the informal settlements across the cities. All the cities commonly experience the economic migrants from the rural areas. In case of Phnom Penh, squatters emerged in the 1980s as repatriated people from the Khmer Rouge camps, migrant workers, and returned soldiers. Although there were some accommodations for these returned people, in reality, the process of resettlement had been influenced by the political and economic power and led to the segregation between the common people and the political elites. In case of Kuala Lumpur, some deliberate creation of squatter was observed. During the communist insurgency in the 1950s to 1960s, some Chinese origin people were specifically made into illegal squatters by using the condition of the land status. Next slide. Informal dwellers faced many forms of spatial exclusion. Most of them are not able to access land use rights under the complex landscape of land and their invisible status. In the course of urban development, they were often pushed to the peripheral along the city expansion, like the example of Bangkok on the slide. In case of Manila, their presence was strongly observed in the city centers as well, where many of them are living on precarious informal work. Such special patterns are a result of the interdependent economic relationships between classes. In most cases, informal settlements are under the precarious environment. This further stimulated vulnerability, discrimination towards them, and also created justifications of evictions as disaster risk reduction project, which we're gonna address further later on. Next slide, please. In addition to their spatial exclusion, informal settlers experience the other forms of exclusion from civic, political, and social life in multiple ways. For example, in the context of Jakarta, the acquisition of land use rights is not only a matter of legal or illegal tenant status, but extends to the recognition of kampung dwellers as citizens through the recognition of residency. In some cities, there are assigned specific jobs such as garbage collection and drainage cleaning in Manila, and plantation work, railway construction in Kuala Lumpur. Such rigid socioeconomic structures facilitated further stigmatization and class structure. In Manila and Jakarta, cases of, that's okay. Only the client relationship. Cases of patron and client relationships were observed between the dwellers and the authorities. These are either in the more individual forms of, or increasingly in the context of democratization and the progressive recognition of urban poor as an important voting bloc. While it temporarily helped urban poor populations, such relationships intensified their power structures. Overall, these multiple forms of invisibilities and the status of exclusion has been intensifying each other and creating a vicious circle and magnifying their vulnerabilities. Next slide.
So I'll be picking from here. So in the context of this research, we looked at what was available in terms of housing programs and policies as well, and how the provision of housing or the lack thereof relates to the patterns of displacement we are investigating. Although this is not a detailed account, we have tried to trace some trends across the different cities, and although each case presents its own unique characteristics, we can extract an important similarity, namely that in all cities we have seen a shift in the affordable housing production from the public to the private sector. Next slide. So more specifically, until the 1970s, the primary mode of state housing provision in the majority of the cities, primarily those with socialist or left-leaning governments, was public housing for civil servants, like in Ho Chi Minh City, Jakarta, or Kuala Lumpur. During the 70s, we see the establishment of national housing agencies and the first more comprehensive programs, mostly taking the form of high-rise buildings and row houses. However, by the mid-80s and 90s, we start seeing the withdrawal of the state and deregulation of the housing sector. This retreat is attributed to a variety of reasons, including the cost of subsidies and programs, the growing urban population, the lack of political will, and generally the shift of interest towards more profitable development. Next slide. This shift brought about significant changes in the housing landscape altogether. In the target groups of housing programs, the locations of emerging housing complexes, their quality, and the extent to which they cover the needs of people of lower incomes. For instance, while the housing production in some cities may have increased in the hands of the private sector, as was the case in Ho Chi Minh City, it increasingly targeted the emerging middle and upper classes, largely leaving the urban poor on their own devices. This was despite sporadic attempts made by governments to create incentives for the private sector, like we see in Indonesia or the Philippines. Overall, we can argue that the past and existing housing policies, bodies, and programs have not been enough to produce adequate and affordable housing for the urban poor. Next slide. Having framed some of the important conditions that relate to the displacement of urban poor communities, like their non-recognition, the systemic lack of affordable housing, and the accelerated profit-driven urban development, we can zoom in a little more into the regulatory practices of dispossession and displacement. In particular, we look at eviction processes and at the different ways the necessity, quote unquote, of these evictions is framed in order to be made legitimate. Next slide. So from the study of these cities, we can see that evictions have taken place in pretty much every type of political regime and form of social system, including socialist regimes, military dictatorships, periods of economic isolation, and struggles for democratization. During recent economic openings, more democratic governments have done relatively little to stop evictions. In fact, in most cases, they continued supporting them. The graphic on this slide presents an incomplete account of eviction in the studied cities based on the data that we could identify. In most cases, evictions of informal settlements started early on, almost as soon as urbanization started picking up. What we can see there is that large-scale evictions displacing tens of thousands of people at once have generally decreased over time. However, we can safely say that this is not a practice that has stopped altogether. It shall be noted here that this is also a question of recording eviction incidents. So with that in mind, this graph is rather indicative. Next slide. The displacement of mostly, though not exclusively, urban poor communities has been often implemented with the enactment of legislation that allowed for expropriation of land and land acquisition by the state in the interest of the public. Some of these laws originated in the colonial period, others were revisited and redrafted during the economic liberalization in the 1980s and 90s, and they have increasingly taken the form of urban planning regulations, like the introduction of setbacks from the riverbanks and things like that. Though we find that generally the term public interest is very vaguely defined. Next slide. We also see that different conditions make for different levels of displaceability, including the location and centrality of a settlement, its accessibility, ownership status, and even its shape and size, in the sense that these determine its suitability for development. the practice of displacement has led in many cases to a peripheralization of informal settlements, as we see again in these maps of Bangkok. Evictions started taking place to remove communities from central areas where land is more valuable, and the urban poor are pushed to the margins of the city, yet only until development reaches there as well and moves them even further out. Next slide. The increasing pressure for profit-oriented development has sharpened also the strategies used to evict dwellers from their settlements. Across the board, we see numerous violations taking place in the process of eviction, from the lack of consultation, insufficient notice, excessive use of force against residents and activists, destruction of property, detention, intimidation, and even straight-out arson. The evicted can at best expect resettlement in some designated projects, usually in remote locations, or monetary compensation, usually again far below the value of their home or land they occupied. And in some cases, people without what is deemed the necessary documentation are excluded completely from these already insufficient schemes. Next slide. We see significant similarities in the narratives that legitimize eviction, including the common good, public health concerns, the beautification and modernization and the pursuit of the global city, the promotion of growth and more productive functions, public security, which implies the scenario that urban poor communities are in a way troublemakers, the enforcement of law and public order, as well as climate adaptation and flood mitigation. In some cases, these narratives go as far as to claim that evictions are for the dwellers' own good, as they would be relocated into apartments. More often than not, we see combinations of all the above. Such arguments serve to justify the necessity of eviction and draw over communities that have at times existed for decades, as if they are blank areas. Here we see a part of Jakarta before and after the implementation of flood mitigation works that were vigorously propagated since 2012. Almost 1,000 households were evicted between 2015 and 16 from these two communities on each side of the river as part of this river normalization program. Next slide. Similarly, the displacement of some 15,000 dwellers for the development of the new urban zone across the downtown area of Ho Chi Minh City is supported by narratives of a city that is modern, orderly, and breathable, and integrated in the global economy. And from this, we move to the next slide that shows the present situation of this area. Next slide. So in conclusion, what we're seeing very strongly across the cities is that first, eviction or spatial violence is not a singular moment in time. That is to say that from the beginning of rumors about displacement to the moment when residents receive an eviction notice or when their displacement will actually take place, it can be days, it can be months, or several years, at sometimes even decades. Even if the eviction is not taking place, there is always the lingering fear that it can occur at any time. Furthermore, we see a pattern in that eviction is often experienced multiple times as people sometimes return to the places they were evicted from or move elsewhere to squat for the lack of adequate and affordable options, meaning that they remain just as insecure to the potential of another eviction. Hence, we see that informality is both treated with as well as produced by spatial violence. Next slide. So to sum up, we have attempted to understand spatial violence as an entanglement of political regimes of urbanization, exclusionary invisibility and disenfranchisement, housing provision policies and regulatory repertoires of displacement and dispossession, while spatial violence in urban Southeast Asia takes multiple forms, including all the above, like invisibility, lack of housing policies, and a prioritization of urban development as economic development. The most frequent form of spatial violence we have encountered were evictions, dispossession, and displacement.
Thanks a lot, Marina and Shoko. Now I'll give the floor to Elizabeth so she can make the connections with how this can be understood and help us to explain the connections with Yangon.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a few comments that we can use to try to link the working paper more closely with what we're seeing in Yangon, both in the past and in the present. In the paper, we endeavored to kind of compare across the region. And doing so means, of course, we've lost a bit of context and a bit of particularity, as you can't compare across all cities in the same way. Evictions and displacement and spatial exclusion are going to look and feel different in every city according to the local context. And even if we can call such processes eviction in a legal sense or a descriptive sense, the local residences are not going to be the same in every location. And so when we delve more deeply into any particular city, we'll likely see that the repertoires of spatial violence expand beyond those we analyze in the paper and are more situated in their specific social, political, and temporal context, as Giovanna mentioned. So for example, if we look at Yangon, we have forced evictions. That's very clear in the periods of previous military rule in 1958 to 1960, when there were large-scale forced evictions to create new satellite towns across Yangon, and beginning in 1989, following the 1988 uprising, where there were again widespread forced evictions in Burma, moving squatter populations from the center of the city to new satellite towns on the periphery. But we also see at the same time dispossession, which isn't necessarily going to express itself as an eviction. Dispossession in Yangon, at least, has been more where land and property rights are removed from the owners, but people often stay in place. We've seen this across Yangon, and it may be just as common as forced evictions, but there's little research that's been done on what happens when you're dispossessed but not displaced, as the scale of dispossession and land confiscation by the junta in urban areas in the 1980s and 1990s was massive, but we just don't really have the data on what that looks like because we don't see the physical displacement happen. It's more of a legal dispossession. We also have nationalization as another kind of form of spatial violence in Yangon. Following Ne Win's 1962 coup, in 1964, the state began to nationalize commercial enterprises, including their properties. So if you owned a warehouse or a business or a market, if that property was bought in the name of a business rather than in the name of an individual, it was subject to nationalization and confiscation by the government. And this disproportionately impacted the business community, who at that time in the 1960s, following a long period of British rule, it disproportionately ended up impacting people of South Asian descent, which led to large-scale immigration from Myanmar. So here you see immigration, but as a form of displacement, but it's also not recognized as such. It's seen much more to be about the relationship between the state and the property rather than the people. And lastly, in the run-up to the transition, beginning in 2011, there was a massive sell-off from 2009 to 2011 before the 2010 elections, and then in that period following the elections, but before the new parliament sat, a huge sale in state properties. And so this meant that people that had been renting government property often had to leave their homes or businesses quickly during the fire sale. They often were given 2 to 3 weeks notice that they have to move because their property would be sold by the state. And if they returned or stayed on and tried to rent from the new private owner, the rates were increased because previously government ministries were known to have large, cheap plots of land available for cheap rents. And so there's this other kind of element there of sort of an economic displacement in the privatization. And I also want to just mention briefly on the issue of recording and non-recording in documentation that was brought up in the paper. That seemed to come up in almost every city we looked at. And as Shoko mentioned, the issue of documents and documentation in the cases that we saw in the working paper are really twofold. It's both the documentation of the land as well as the documentation of the resident. And now documenting the land, it might start with, making sure it's included in municipal maps, but then there's also issues of zoning. Is it industrial? Is it residential? Is it allowed for housing? Has the plot been subdivided? Who is the owner? Are there multiple owners? What kind of land is it? Is it government land? Is it private? Is it religious in the case of Myanmar? And then you have the issue of documenting the relationship. What's that relationship between the resident and the land? Are they an owner, a tenant, a squatter, a steward? So all these questions of documentation come up here. And if land isn't documented or the housing is built over top a drainage canal, as we often see in cities in Southeast Asia, particularly in Yangon, that's going to come up on a map as drainage and government-owned land, not as housing. So it means there's likely no address for that location, because how do you give a street address, like a postal address, to a drain canal? And if there's no address, then it's difficult to claim a residency. But in Myanmar, as well as in Indonesia and other locations in the region, residency is really essential for the creation of civil documentation. First, in the form of a household list in Burma, or a family card as it's known in Indonesia. And secondly, for the ID card, the KTP or the Meponten in Burma. And not having a recognized address means you can't get this household list, and not being on a household list means you can't apply for a citizenship scrutiny card, your civil documentation in Myanmar. And so it's what Shoko was mentioning as this kind of vicious circle, that you need one to get the other, and it kind of goes around and around. And the knock-on effects of this, I think, are really huge and are really what we're talking about. We're talking about disenfranchisement. You're not able to travel, you can't open a bank account, you can't get formal employment, including in factories. You can't draw an old age pension, you can't draw Social Security payments for pregnant and nursing women, you can't graduate from university, a whole list of exclusions. And these are kind of deliberate acts of non-recognition that lead to denial of citizenship from the urban poor, but also from religious and ethnic minorities, directly linking their housing situation to their identity. And then I want to comment briefly just on the current context in Myanmar. Following the military coup on February 1st, the nationwide demonstrations and the civil disobedience movement are currently ongoing. And urban poor groups are now organizing and marching the demonstrations as urban poor collectives. Street vendors are participating, they're passing out free food to demonstrators, trishaw drivers are riding in protests, creating their own protests, and giving people free rides to join the protest. There's this unity that's being seen now in what is being called the Spring Revolution, that people have described as not feeling previously, or not previously having experience in this way. And it's inspiring to see how people are supporting each other in this general strike. But we also are seeing new forms of spatial violence. Civil servants who are participating in the movement by refusing to work for the military government are being evicted from their government provided housing. This may not be the only type of eviction we see as things continue. There's cause for worry that the household registration system in Myanmar will further restrict the housing opportunities, both of the urban poor, as well as be used as a tool to root out activists. The military have made it very clear that their rationale behind the coup is about voter fraud. And they've extensively discussed their allegations that voter lists, which are based on household lists that I mentioned previously, contained non-citizens, contained people who do not actually live at the address where they say they live, which, given the explanation I just gave about if you live on top of a drain, how do you call that an address on an official document, right? So you can see that's probably quite a lot of people. In short, they're likely referring to the millions of urban poor who voted without having an ID card. And they're also referring to religious and ethnic minorities whose citizenship applications have yet to be processed. And so therefore, on paper, all of these people are non-citizens. In this context, cleaning up these voter lists would mean household checks on residents to compare those living in a dwelling to those on the list. And we actually saw this happen last night in Yangon. Overnight, as the military has now reinvoked an old law for guest registrations that basically requiring like every overnight guest in your home to be registered. So this means that the only people legally allowed to spend the night in your house are those who are already on your household list and those who are now on your registered guest list. So last night, the military conducted and police conducted door-to-door checks that led to the arrest of at least 15 people in one ward. And I heard other accounts that said much higher numbers, but at least 15, as protesters were caught in the area in the afternoon, and then curfew fell. And so they had to shelter with local residents to avoid arrest. So police went door to door checking lists to root out demonstrators. In terms of, the research on spatial violence, I unfortunately think we're just going to have more and more to look at here. But I think there are other kinds of hope. I mean, in our working paper, we didn't get to include this, but Shoko and Marina have done quite a lot of work on delving more deeply into responses to spatial violence. How do communities organize around spatial violence, both by residents as well as by civil society activists and organizations. And so this is an area that I think hopefully we'll get a chance to more deeply delve into and pay further attention to. And that will be the next step in this project.
Thanks a lot, Izzy. So now, because we are running out of time, I'll give the floor to Hyun, and then please, people, if you are interested, there's already one question in the Q&A. Just type your question and I will voice that to the panelist. Hyun?
Okay, thank you very much. I understand, given the remaining time, and also because of the need of receiving some questions and responding to those questions in your Q&A, I try to make it as concise as I can, probably using about 3 to 5 minutes at the most.
Perfectly fine. I'm sure the attendees wouldn't mind to stay over 5 more minutes or so. So it's okay.
So I had a fortune of reading the report in advance, which I really enjoyed. And it is very comprehensive in terms of its coverage. It's a great a task to be able to compare a number of different cities in Southeast Asia, which all have disparate historical, political, social, economic backgrounds. And I guess I won't repeat what has been emphasized as the main the learning outcomes from this study, apart from just mentioning that this is a really interesting study that looks at the displacement issue, which the team takes it at the core of their inquiries on Southeast Asian cities. And of course, there's the spatial violence dimension, especially the post-eviction and displacement, which are seen to be, according to the report, significant aspects of Asian urbanity, which I very much, a perspective I very much welcome. There's an interesting discussion about exclusionary invisibility, which you are hearing about. And in this regard, I guess my questions will be really about how these exclusion or even the displacement is being justified. So I guess this is where my more or less kind of a constructive critique and engagement with the study may be situated, with the hope of, as the study continues, to be able to somehow incorporate. So it's a kind of friendly critique, not meant to convey any negative notions. I guess before going into that, one quick point to point out is the issue of housing provision. So we get to hear a lot in the report about how housing itself was involving the role of the public sector, as well as the private sector in many instances. But I guess in a sense, this is inevitable in terms of how we kind of try to restrict our attention to the roles of the private and the public sectors and how they actually implement what sort of housing policies for the low-income people and so on. But we also understand and hear from many different sources the public sector has been quite limiting in terms of designing and implementing such state-led and housing policies, and which also means the majority of housing being provided by the people themselves in a number of different ways. So I guess this is something we often come across in a study, because of the nature of this study that spans across different geographies. We try to understand how these policies are coming to exist and what the roles of the private and public sectors are. But because the ways in which people respond to the need of housing are quite diverse, and so diverse that it's difficult to be captured by a single research team. and often runs the risk of somehow showing a kind of state-centric tendency in the explanation, even though it wasn't intended. And I guess this is something we often come across, as I was saying, in many other studies, and it's not something this study itself is featuring. But I guess going forward, it'll be useful to think about how the kind of bottom-up approaches in the way, especially given the post-colonial perspective the study itself has been adopting, how that bottom-up perspectives can be brought into to understand a bit more about how the housing itself is being provided with the input coming from the majority population. But this also takes us to some difficulties, especially during this COVID pandemic. So, especially during the COVID era, when the mobility itself is the privilege of the state authority, which basically prescribes the rules and the boundaries of mobility itself, and it's very difficult for any single researcher to go about freely in the way that we are able to. Assuming that there's no kind of restriction coming from the authority on the academic freedom itself. But so that's already quite difficult already before COVID, and now during the COVID and with all the restrictions on mobility, it's going to be even more difficult to actually go about doing this bottom-up and grounded approach to understanding how people respond to their housing need. So I guess it's a challenge, I guess many researchers may be experiencing, and I'd be curious actually to know a bit more about how the team is going to address this challenge in the coming years, or coming months, sorry. But the second and last point is about how the displacement or exclusion is being justified. So we get to hear from the report a very wide-ranging setup in the regions, rationales for eviction according to the report, which actually demonstrate the aspirations, different degree of aspirations across geographies, but nevertheless the aspirations of the government and the private businesses who are willing to invest in their economic and make their economic and political investment, and aim for a very quick returns on investment, on their investment. And I think that aspiration basically drives the pace of development, and in turn the pace of the eviction, displacement, and dispossession. I really welcome the question Easy Rhodes was raising in a summary about what do you do when dispossession happens without incurring physical displacement. So I guess that's a question that's going to be very important. And also to address the question, it's important to understand what the rationales of for eviction, or what sort of aspirations political and economic elites bring into the play. But my question, I guess, and the suggestion is to understand a bit more about. So that's kind of an understanding of political and economic elite can also be sort of in a top-down way of understanding what they do, especially those who are in possession of power and resource. But in a sense, as we can see from a number of different examples and experiences in the past in Asia and elsewhere, I think there's also a greater degree of possibility of how such type of displacement and eviction or exclusion is also being justified by people themselves. And here, of course, the people itself is to be understood in a very heterogeneous way. There will be all sorts of differences within the population. You can either look at the middle class or upper middle class, or the low income, or you can use many different types of producing the division and boundaries within the population. But I think as we understand from all the discussions about ideology, the hegemonic ideology from more Gramscian perspective, and so on, we also understand all of these discourses are also something many people are readily adopting, even though they may not be having the same kind of material conditions or socioeconomic conditions as their counterparts who are more affluent. But even the low-income people may also be sometimes readily adopting, as if such an ideology that supports and justifies eviction and displacement is their own, even though their material basis itself may not be the same as who are benefiting from such displacement. So I guess this is something that requires a bit more understanding of how these discourses and ideologies are being produced and consumed across populations, and how this is also being exploited by political and economic elites. And all of these are requiring really a very much a grounded approach to doing research, so that beyond the kind of secondary data in a review that the report was able to carry out really in an excellent way. I guess going forward, it'll be really interesting to hear how people themselves are understanding displacement, eviction, as well as dispossession. So I think I'll stop there, and really enjoyed the report, and congratulations to the team.
Thanks a lot, Hyun. Yeah, a lot of food for thought, many aspects that we've been also discussing. Perhaps just right before going to the questions, I'm just going to try to respond to one few of the provocations there. I think the main, let's say, tenet of the research project is trying to demonstrate how community-led housing is a viable opportunity to think differently outside, let's say, the market logic. And fortunately, before even the lockdown happened, Marina and Shoko, and particularly Women for the World, has been working directly in testing options that are, let's say, viable to do so. So we are going to be kind of delving into that information that was already, let's say, collected on a primary databases, but for sure now with the current conditions, any work on the ground is basically put on hold. So we will have to see how things evolve. But yeah, that's one of the key elements. But it was important for us to understand this kind of the backdrop at regional level, to also define, well, what are the singularities of the Yangon story. And even the notion of the title of the Yangon stories was intending to do a more qualitative work, trying to collect the storytelling of the experience of people themselves. But now we are in the dilemma of how to go about it and what digital ethnography would allow us to do, and also what are the inherent limitations of that digital ethnography as a methodology going forward in this pandemic. And I think we're all facing similar circumstances. So I'm going to try to read some of the questions. I think there are very interesting ones. Freddy from Jakarta says hi to Marina. And he says, the issue for housing professionals, for my understanding, is that the state does not have enough fiscal capacity for public housing provision and is not economically viable for upgrading informal settlements in the city center. Public-private partnerships are being proposed by private developers are more attracted to commercial housing. From your research, what would be the best cost-benefit model to convince housing authorities to protect and nurture these informal settlements? So I'm going to read them all, and I guess everyone can pick up, because we have, there are things that are connected in the questions. Baobe, hi, another bad alumni. She says, thank you for the great work. I'm working as a gender and climate change expert at UN Women Regional Officer for Asia and the Pacific. It would be great if the following researchers could look into gender impacts of spatial violence and how women collectives are coping, acting upon it. Marina and Shoko, if you have witnessed any of these, could you please share with us? And I think Shoko has been sharing something there, but maybe we can mention something in the comments. Sarijat says, among the residents of Southeast Asian cities, do you see any kind of grassroots organization against displacement of the urban poor and gentrification? Or are these policies and regulations being received in popularity? Approaching the topic of spatial violence in philosophical terms, do you think that the informal dwelling situation reduced the subjectivity and humanity of this urban poor compared to the housed? Oh, now it moved. What happened with that question? Something happened in the questions there. It moved and disappeared.
No, I think someone answered and then
okay.
to the answered section.
Okay. So Giovanna, maybe you can respond online. because these people are unhoused and evicted, they are seen as less humans compared to the house residents. And then Sapto, hi Sapto. Thank you for the work and the presentation. I'm curious regarding the idea that is suggested how informality is seen as both as treated and produced by reiterative cycles of displacement. Do you work see itself interacting on learnings from all these contexts to postulate and even speculate an alternative set of alternatives? Ratula, hey, from Mumbai, thank you for the excellent presentation and more deeper explanations provided by the Myanmar case. Well, it seems the process of displacement, invisibilization, exclusion played out across these cities, irrespective of the political regimes and even economic policies. I am wondering if there is a way to historicize and comment on the contingent ways in which these are playing out. We undertook a study of socio-spatial transformation in Mumbai, Rio, and Durban. And one of the things that became clear in our study was that the drivers of structural violence were different in each case and also produced different kinds of resistances from the ground up. And violence was therefore experienced very differently in the three contexts. While Rio and Durban were considered overtly violent, it wasn't so much the case in Mumbai. It would be good to understand how spatial violence is conceptualized and used in this study. Abdul Malik, hi, very good to have you here. What are the conceptual differences and political implications between spatial violence and more generalized processes of unsettlement, where many arrangements are thrown up in the air, prompting recalibrations of all kinds in the ways in which are not necessarily dispossessive, a kind of volatility that is not clearly generative or destructive, and in which the poor often invest in because dispositions could go in many different ways. A lot of very interesting questions. Who would like to pick up the answers? I think there are kind of two blocks. One, the more conceptual that Giovanna was trying to type, coming from Abdul Malik and Sajirat. Maybe Ratula was also referring to the conceptual element. I don't know if Giovanna wants to refer to it. And maybe Marina Shoko Isi, if you want to answer the question more related to the experience with community-led developments and the gender role in these processes. Gio, would you like to start?
Apologies, I was trying to reply in the Q&A section, so I replied to two of them.
Okay. Would you like to do summary?
Sorry.
Yeah. No, go
yes,
ahead.
there was a question around what were the main points underpinning spatial violence that we had found in the cities that Marina and Sugar presented. And I think, I made a kind of a short list of them that was referring back to what I was saying at the beginning. So the fact that spatial violence is ordinary, is embedded in routine practices, is sustained, is generative. So those main 3 points. There was also another question that was quite difficult about the relationship between spatial violence and othering processes, or considering people who are excluded from housing processes as less than humans. And I agree with the question basically, but I don't have a reply on that.
Marina,
sorry, I'm still reading through the other ones.
Yeah. Marina Shoko, would you like to share some responses?
I'll just jump in really quickly
Okay,
on
go.
that question that Gio tried to answer about the subjectivity of urban poor. And just like with a really quick anecdote, one of the things that we found so far in our work on Yangon is that if you look at like the 1940s and 1950s, when people are talking about residents in informal housing, most of these people were refugees from the Second World War. They were flooding into the city from the countryside because the fighting was pretty terrible, and the Yangon's population mushroomed in size, and so people were living in wherever they could, and it also had been bombed twice, so people were living in basically like lots that had been bombed or like half collapsed buildings, and they put up a shelter where like one wall was still standing and make a lean-to there and things like that. And so when that was the case, people didn't refer to the person as being a squatter. If you read the newspaper reports from that time, both in Burmese and in English, they're talking about it as new neighborhoods or new wards. And so it's the space that is being constructed. It's not the personhood, right? But if we look at, and this actually continues up until the 90s. And then at some point in the past 20 or 25 years or so, there's a shift in terminology. And you start to see not the space being called out as being informal or not uniform or dirty or whatever. It's not the space that's being called out, it's the person. And you start to hear this word chucho, which is like literally like invader or trespasser. And so it's the person that is being seen as the problem, as the other, as the criminal perhaps, rather than the space itself being seen as something that, we need to fix this kind of space because we have all these war refugees. And we clearly don't have enough housing. It was the construction shifted dramatically. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, but definitely something we're paying attention to.
Thank you. Perhaps quickly, Marina and Shoko would like to respond some of the questions.
Maybe I can answer that the one about the housing thing from Freddie. We didn't like go into the technical thing like economic analysis or something, but the older cases, cities studies, there were no observed cases with successful privatization or even PPP schemes in the study, despite of the efforts to introduce policies or incentives to the private developers. There's several reasons for this. Might be the unprofitability of affordable housing, and also mismatch of the demands between the developer and the users, and then also inflexible or restricted regulations by the state, and the state also didn't help the people to proceed or supply the documentation because many people didn't have that things. So that is what we have observed. But in terms of the upgradation, generally in situ upgradation were said to be not only socially better, but also economically or efficient process in many other cities cases. So, but maybe like the cities we chose to study didn't reflect or those aspect to their policies. So they didn't do much of that in situ upgradation.
Yeah, I think we are very out of time. I don't know if Marina would like to make any short comment.
Maybe just to pick on the last question, like, I mean, this is to me the $1 million question, like how can can we imagine an effective and cost efficient model? I think what I would say to that is a model that that includes the people in the decision of what happened with them, where they end up living, and it's not a model or a scheme or a practice that erases them without even giving them notice, without consulting them, without informing them. Yeah, I don't know if I should take any question or we wrap it up.
I think we need to wrap up because we are a bit over time. I think what we could say is we can save the question and try to answer afterwards. There are very interesting points that it also help us to think in what is coming. I think Baobe brings the intersectionality story that was part of what we wrote in our proposal, and somehow having as partners Women for the World, we were giving centrality to the, let's say, a more gender analysis of the housing, the community-led housing responses. And I think about the question of unsettlement, I think that is a very interesting one. A lot of the times previously when we were able to engage with people directly, that was also part of what was coming up in the conversations, in the more informal conversations we were having. So I think we were expecting to do more kind of ethnographic work, but now we will see how to take and not to lose those nuances given the conditions we are living in. So thank you for all the comments, and stay tuned with the upcoming work that we will be presenting that is in the queue for being out to some scrutiny and perhaps collaboration. So thank you so much. So we're going to have to close now, and I hope you have enjoyed the presentation. Take a look at the report and send us any email or drop us any line if you want to keep the conversation going. Thanks a lot and see you soon. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe. Bye.